Byronic versus Wordsworthian solitudes. What you had to say. Well, Danielle, Byron's delivery portrays a sense of uncaring, almost as if he sees all these amazing things that nature has to offer and turns away from it unimpressed and unmoved. Awoke the jocund birds to early song in glens which might have made even exile dear, though on his brow were graven lines austere and tranquil sternness, which had taken the place of feelings fierier far, but less severe. If Wordsworth had written something like this, the jocund or cheerful birds waking him up would have told him something, captivated him, and opened his eyes to something more meaningful. Whereas Byron is stern, unmoved by this very beautiful piece of nature. Well said, Daniel. Note how Byron, Harold, is said to pass along, quote, not insensibly, all which here in the beautiful landscape awoke the jocund birds. You see, despite the sternness, he is touched by what he sees. He's not insensible to those jocund or cheerful birds. It's made clear. There's a double negative in there that's very easy to miss. The Bray contributed, yes, Wordsworth's approach it's more healing. Wordsworth's approach is more healing. He believes that nature serves as a moral and emotional teacher, rather than mere pleasant jocund or best dear refuge. In Tintern Abbey, he found that nature, quote, never did betray the heart that loved her. For Wordsworth, solitude leads to outward unity, empathy, and wisdom through a tranquil restoration. Byron's Childe Harold, on the other hand, seeks solitude not as an end in itself, but merely as a form or means of rebellion and escape. Thus, Bray is arguing, he turned to nature, would Byron, even were it neither jocund, jolly, or even dear and lovable. He'd still turn to it. He just needs a place to get away from all the people, right? And I think this is an interesting claim, and it was echoed by a bunch of you. You were echoing each other. Nobody gets really shall we say, initial credit or original credit for this claim because it was just so common. It was a consensus claim. John agrees. John, for example, agrees. Quote, Byron's Childe Harold wants to be alone in nature due to the alienation he feels from those around him rather than his character's quest for solace in the natural world. Again, that's put very pithily. He wants to get away from society more than to get to nature. And I'll be saying a qualified version of something very like this very soon, like in the next plate. I'll be talking a little bit about his tactical, as I see it, this might be 2 plates forward, his tactical naturalism. Okay? As all the nautical imagery suggests, for example, that stanza famously that begins once more upon the waters, John argues, Childe Harold chooses to seek the freedom and independence nature offers, rather than, as does Wordsworth, by contrast, using its peace and tranquility to better himself, morally even. Again, I feel the need to qualify. It's not as if the Byronic persona finds in nature nothing but a refuge, nothing of genuine interest or value in itself, nothing of delight or of solace. I would beware of oversimplification and overstatement with respect to this Byronic form of naturalism, okay? Because he's so extreme. He tends to call forth extreme statements from us. Note Kimberly's sensible contribution. Byron, quote, describes nature as more of a genuine companion. Where rose the mountains, there to him were friends. Where rolled the ocean, thereon was his home. That's a very important stanza that I'll be paying some attention to very soon. Companionship then, friendship even. Again, see the next plate. But once this qualification is in place, John's statement I think is very accurate, and at times one can feel that Byron's speaker is damning nature with faint praise. As Noah quotes, the speaker notes that he can see nothing to loathe in nature. I mean, what a compliment to pay nature. You're not as loathsome. I can see nothing to loathe in you, of the sort, that I've been loathing so constantly here in my social life. As Rachel suggests, a measure of how limited, okay, that's what we're saying, is this kind of qualified and limited Byronic naturalism that may be found in Byron, especially in his poem Childe Harold. A measure of how limited is Byron's naturalism may be found in the mere fact that Childe Harold does not want to be in the nature close to him. He loathed in his native land to dwell. Presumably, this close land of England, if we go by Wordsworth and Coleridge and Blake and pretty much every romantic or even non-romantic writer, of the past 1,000 years who's written about England, there's just lots of wonderful natural getaways here in this island kingdom. But for Childe Harold, and I think the Byronic persona, let's call it, which is this larger kind of congeries of Byronic masks that we can see. We're going to get another one with Don Juan. For the Byronic sort of persona, for the Byronic hero, the Byronic personality, anything close by, once he's disgusted, is itself disgusted. It proves disgusting, is tainted. Even like a beautiful natural landscape, Rachel's suggesting, as nature can never be. In other words, going back to what, those birds that Danielle was talking about, if those birds are English birds, you're probably right, Danielle. If they're English birds, he's probably not going to, he's going to be insensible to any kind of delight that they may intimate to him. But once he's out of nature, once he's away from that immediacy of disgust that he feels, associated with his native country, and gets to, for example, Switzerland, it's a little bit different. Okay. He's no matter how disgusted, let me finish out the paragraph. No matter how disgusted he is with people, Wordsworth, by contrast to Byron, can just walk outdoors. Okay. And the disgust does not extend outside of the doorway as it does for Childe Harold, which is a measure of his disgust, but also the limitations of nature, if you see what I'm saying, to interrupt that disgust. For him, his nature, his sense of nature. Byron's persona has to, in order to get away, he has to go to Switzerland. Now, Ali calls our attention to something I think is very important that I'll be talking about in a couple of plates. Okay, a few stanzas that show up relatively late in our excerpt from Canto 3. At one point, quote, Byron writes as if nature is part of him. I live not in myself, but I become portion of that around me. He's become one with nature, Ali claims. Unlike Byron, Wordsworth was more in communion with nature, not intertwined with it. Now, I have to differ with one half of this. In poems like Tintern Abbey and The Prelude and lots of other poems by Wordsworth, Wordsworth has moments of intertwinement or entwinement, as well as moments of mere communion. He has both kinds of moments, it seems to me, and I think it seems to a lot of people, okay? But Ali's point, okay, about this particular moment in Byron these stanzas recorded here, stanzas 70, 75, right? Usually Byron is the one who merely communes in a friendly fashion, right? And does not intertwine. I'll be, again, making this point very clear, I hope, in a couple of plates. And yet here, again, in the stanza 70, 75, he imagines entwinement of a sort, as we will see, even more thoroughgoing than what we usually find in Wordsworth. And as I say, this passage is discussed in a couple of plates, and I'll be making this point about this sort of radical potential in Byron. He just sort of flies off the handle in a lot of different directions. He's more disgusted with society than Coleridge and Wordsworth ever were, maybe even more than Blake. He has to leave. Blake never has to leave, never feels he has to leave England. Although actually there were a couple of moments that he had, but not in anything that we read, right? Do we see evidence of it? And but Byron, is this sort of, he dies in Greece and is this sort of continental exile for most of his life, even though he's an English Lord Byron. All right, he has a very solid place in the English class system, and yet he feels he has to leave, right? And so there's something extreme about that, and there's something also extreme, strangely and weirdly, this very limited naturalism that we have already begun to see some evidence of, and that I'll be developing. The point I'll be developing in these plates that follow is that you can find a moment, again, stanza 70 to 75, where he sort of outdoes Wordsworth in his naturalism. So he just seems to be all over the map, adopting all kinds of extreme positions as the moment arises. And those extreme postures and positions, I don't think they're mere posturing. I think there's something authentic about him that we find very powerful in Byron, okay? And that distinguishes him in certain ways from, I think, even Shelley and Keats and, some of the more politically radical, Shelley especially, politically radical of his fellow romantic poets. He has a sort of radicalism of moods that I think is worth, celebrating and somewhat being amazed by. So let's continue. Byronic solitude versus the Wordsworthian. Where's the best place to look? Childe Harold, Canto 3, stanzas 12 to 16. But soon he knew himself the most unfit. This is the Byronic speaker, the Byronic narrator of what is really a narrative poem. Soon he knew himself the most unfit of men to herd with man, with whom he held. He's talking about Childe Harold, with whom he held little in common. Untaught to submit his thoughts to others, though his soul was quelled in youth by his own thoughts, still uncompelled, he would not yield dominion of his mind to spirits against whom his own rebelled. Proud though in desolation, which could find a life within itself to breathe without mankind. Where rose the mountains, there to him were friends. Where rolled the ocean, thereon was his home. Where a blue sky and glowing clime extends, he had the passion and the power to roam. The desert, forest, cavern, breakers' foam were unto him companionship. They spake a mutual language, clearer than the tone of his land's tongue, which he would oft forsake, for nature's pages glassed by sunbeams on the lake. Like the Chaldean, he could watch the stars, till he had peopled them with beings bright as their own beams, and earth-born jars, and human frailties were quite forgotten quite. Could he have kept his spirit to that flight, he had been happy. But this clay, the body, will sink its spark immortal, envying it the light to which it mounts, as if to break the link that keeps us from yon heaven, which woos us to its brink. Now note how self-knowledge, won by way of social contact, leads to social alienation in Byron. His knowledge, Childe Harold's knowledge of self, is knowledge of his alienation. Knowledge of his alienation, that's how he knows himself. That's how he defines himself, as one who doesn't fit in readily, right? And who will not, once youth is past, compel himself to do so. He is thus self-exiled, as we read down below in line 136. You don't get the feeling that he's been ostracized so much as, in a sense, self-ostracized, self-excluded. Wordsworth, by contrast, in Tintern Abbey, speaks of, quote, the fever of the world, the sneers of selfish men, greetings where no kindness is, right? Nevertheless, you get the feeling that maybe he has felt that bite in the way that Lord Byron, he's an English lord, and was a very popular guy in his social groups, didn't really feel as though he had been cast out by others so much as that he didn't fit in and wanted to, in a sense, cast himself out. Nevertheless, the social is here defined as radically antithetical to the individual. What I should have said is, therefore, the social is here defined as radically antithetical to the individual. It doesn't matter whether he was cast out by society, whether he cast himself out because he just hates society so much and doesn't see a home for himself there. Either way you slice it, the social is here characterized as something that's just very much at odds with what we are as individuals, right? Or at least what he is. The social requires submission of thoughts and submission of soul, violation of the individual's autonomy, integrity, and autonomy. We find something like this in Wordsworth too, We do we not? And we could quote some lines from Wordsworth to this effect. But I think you would agree, the Byron persona makes Wordsworth, who would seem to prefer to be alone most of the time, that at least we could say about him, or to be accompanied by a few silent, nameless, faceless friends. We never hear the names of any of his friends, those boyhood friends that show up in the Prelude. This makes, Byron makes, in his kind of misanthropy and anti-sociality, the Byronic persona makes Wordsworth look like a social butterfly. He, by contrast, characterizes himself as a wild-born falcon with clipped wing, to whom the boundless air alone were home, eagerly the barred-up bird beating his breast and beak, until he's bloody. Little wonder that he becomes, in those moments in which he must spend time in man's dwellings, a thing restless and worn and stern and wearisome. Wordsworth, by contrast, when he's in his rooms, in man's dwellings, tends to report moods of pensiveness. He's pensive, vacant. He's the occupant of lonely rooms, right? He too is out of his element, but don't you feel it's far less radically, even violently so? Okay, well, what about the Byronic figure, the Byronic persona, Childe Harold. We're going to see Don Juan has certain things in common with Childe Harold, though it's not quite so autobiographical. We're going to see that here this coming week. What about when he's in his element? In other words, in nature. In nature, once in nature, he finds, as we have said, and as we saw in the last plate, courtesy of Kimberly, friends, companionship, whether with mountains, ocean, blue sky, glowing clime, desert, etc. Sounds Wordsworthian, doesn't it? But as several noted, right, Byronic nature lacks staying power as it did for Maria. It is not here spoken of as getting deep into a system. Not typically, as we're going to see there's an exception to this. It's not here spoken of as getting deep into a system. It's not, quote, this is a quotation from Tinter and Abbey, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. Rather, it stays separate, merely providing a kind of compensation for social alienation that can be described as, strangely, social. Notice how nature is characterized in these lines. Nature speaks to him. He can hear and understand its language, right? So it's almost like an interlocutor. It's company, nature's company. And its pages may be read, right? What, nature has a printing press and puts out books as well as speaks and entertains you and has a language that you know how to read, you know how to speak. There's no sense of anything deeply interfused, such as we saw in Tinter and Abbey. Soon he moves on and up to the stars, as if having tired of more terrestrial nature's company and seeking a new company. His restlessness with companies of any kind extends to the natural. Can you kind of see that? That he ends up seeing, despising his friends, finds new friends out in the natural world. And he's not spoken of as learning to despise them, but it is interesting, isn't it, how he somewhat restlessly, like the Chaldean, turns to the stars. He could watch the stars till he peopled them with beings bright as their own beams. As though he's tends to turn away from any society in which he finds himself. He will find himself ultimately feeling restless and dissatisfied and will want to move on. So he goes up to the stars, and you wonder where he's going to turn to after he's done with the stars, when he's, somewhat disgusted with the company of the stars. I want you to perceive that essential restlessness of the Byronic persona, okay, with respect to any company in which the sense of the social obtains, okay, which even when it doesn't obtain immediately, it obtains eventually. So here is a discussion of those stanzas in Childe Harold that I think were of such interest that come a little bit later in the excerpt. I'll just read a few of the stanzas here to begin with. The boldest steer but where their ports invite, but there are wanderers o'er eternity whose bark drives on and anchored ne'er shall be. And we know that one of those wanderers is Childe Harold, and perhaps the Byron speaker, Byronic persona, who was narrating the poem as well. So, 71. Is it not better then to be alone, given that all we're doing is wandering around from place to place, right? Invited or not by ports, okay, if we're of this sort, if we're one of these wanderers of eternity, is it not better then to be alone and love earth only, just earth, for its earthly sake, by the blue rushing of the arrowy Rhone, or the pure bosom of its nursing lake, which feeds it as a mother who doth make a fair but froward infant her own care, kissing its cries away as these awake? Is it not better thus our lives to wear, than join the crushing crowd, doomed to inflict or bear? Let me get this very famous stanza from Childe Harold. I live not in myself, but I become portion of that around me, and to me high mountains are a feeling, but the hum of cities torture. I could see nothing to loathe in nature, save to be a link reluctant in a fleshly chain, classed among creatures, when the soul can flee, and with the sky, the peak, the heaving plain of ocean, or the stars, mingle and not in vain. And it goes on from there, but let's just press on at this point with our discussion. Wait, down the road a bit in Canto 3, the Byronic speaker returns to the topic of nature in its relation or connection to it, and here, okay, he sounds pretty Wordsworth. Sounds pretty much like Wordsworth, pretty Wordsworthian. He speaks of mingling, okay, intertwining, entwinement. He speaks of mingling with sky, the peak, the heaving plain of ocean, or the stars. unless we want to dismiss this, we talk about mingling when we go to a party, right? We want to dismiss this as a social sort of mingling. It cannot help but remind us of Wordsworthian interfusing, right? You remember that line, something far more deeply interfused, which I've quoted in front of you probably 15 times, right? All of these, he asserts, mountains, waves, and skies, are a part of me and of my soul, as I of them. Wordsworth couldn't have put it better. And yet, we should not fail to notice the speaker's assertions come along in the form of questions. Are not the mountains such? Okay? Is it not better than to be alone? Is not the love of these deep in my heart with a pure peace? Should I not contemn all objects if compared with these? It's interesting, isn't it, that this, what seem to be assertions, and there are some assertions, I live not in myself, but I become portion of that around me. But most of what he has to assert about his relationship with nature is not really asserted when you look at it closely. These seeming assertions, are they even assertions? The mood is not declarative. I'm talking grammatically here. The grammatical mood is not declarative, but interrogative. One could describe Byron's Wordsworthianism as interrogative, even quizzical to him as to Wordsworth. High mountains are a feeling. But it's interesting. It's not one that he wants to talk about at length, is it? Unlike Wordsworth, I think you would agree. Wordsworth wants to talk about it at length. Rather, the Byronic persona's Wordsworthian statements tend to give way, once uttered, immediately to expressions of loathing for the human social alternative. High mountains are a feeling, but the hum of human cities torture. Do you see what I mean? Wouldn't you expect him, high mountains are a feeling, and then he goes on to talk about that feeling at length, but no, he's immediately back to the question of what's driven him, as you have said so well, what drove him into the high mountains to begin with, where he could have that feeling, which is the hum of human cities, which he finds torturous, right? So you can conclude, I would warily conclude these things, but I would conclude that it's as if the Byronic persona indulges Wordsworthian sentiment just in order to provide a contrast, one much to the disfavor of the crushing crowd. And this is not at all far from the statements made by a number of you in your responses to this item, the item on solitude, for this week's discussion board. One could venture that Byron's romantic naturalism, then, is largely tactical. Now, you understand what I mean by that. It's just something that he does in order to get something else done, which is get away from, this is, again, very close to what you were saying, get away from the social, get away from his friends, his company, his family, everything to do with his social life in England. That may be unfair to call his naturalism merely, a means to an end, merely, or even largely. I think especially if you said it was just merely tactical. His naturalism was merely a means to an end that was not naturalism. Could be described as unfair, but at the very least one feels that his feeling, mountains are a feeling, his feeling for mountains is not as strong as his feeling against cities. Okay? So his misanthropy comes across as primary. His naturalism, well, at best secondary. And as Bates says, and I hope you will watch that section in Bate, you could watch the whole thing if you wanted, but that section in Bate is very illuminating and gives you a lot of context for understanding Byron's career. As Bates says, later, in Don Juan, he's satirizing anything to do with Wordsworth and anything to do with Wordsworthian interfusion, something far more deeply interfused. Okay, so he's going to be doing that down the road. And what I want to suggest is even when he's at his most Wordsworthian, it seems to be a Wordsworthianism that has been adopted tactically, as I said before, and at best it's a secondary commitment, secondary to his opposition, his decommitment, radical decommitment to the social in the urban and contemporary English history. Now, all this being said, note the following expression of a more profound contemptus mundi, hatred of the world, one that extends beyond the social to the corporeal. This is an interesting moment in the poem that complicates things a little bit, right? And when at length, this is 74, which I haven't read yet to you aloud, and when at length the mind shall be all free from what it hates in this degraded form. You would expect that to be a social form. But look, reft of its carnal life, save what shall be existent, happier in the flying worm, when elements to elements conform, and dust, the dust of the body has become dust. Dust is as it should be. Shall I not feel all I see less dazzling, but more warm? The bodiless thought, the spirit of each spot, of which even now I share at times the immortal lot. This is curious. Here Byron derives not social life, but carnal life, okay? Preferring the bodiless thought to anything embodied, fleshly, or physical. This is, again, more radical than Wordsworth, but the other way, if you see what I'm saying. It's more radical in its naturalism, which we said he's more radical in his anti-sociality. We have established that than his Wordsworth, Coleridge, or maybe even Blake, right? Very radical in his feelings, his antisocial feelings, and there's some of them border on the misanthropic, right? Which means you just hate all humanity. But it's interesting, he doesn't seem to like the body in this moment. He seems to have turned against the body, right? And it's radical turning against the body and shucking off the body is what is imagined, so that he can get very close, mingle very intimately indeed, okay, with the world outside of the body, which seems to just get in the way, with these other bodies, these natural bodies. So it's still naturalism, if you see what I'm saying, right? That he's entertaining here as a mood. It's a naturalist mood that's very much what you might see in Wordsworth, but it's more extreme than you find in Wordsworth, okay, typically. It's more radical in its naturalism, and not just in its anti-sociality. So again, we have this, do we not have some evidence of a poet here who is doing some of the things we've seen the other poets do, especially this business of naturalism, right? And this feeling that he has about solitude. He's representing solitude in a way that you could find in Coleridge and in Wordsworth, but you feel that it's more, it's not just more radically sought, given the disgust he feels when he's in company, but once he gets out there, he has a moment like this, where it's kind of more radically indulged, more radically explored, right? The body itself gets in the way, in a way that I don't think it does in Wordsworth, right? The closest we come to it in Wordsworth, perhaps, is that early passage, you may have thought of this upon reading this stanza, that early passage in Tintern Abbey that characterizes, quote, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony, in the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. Note the near arrest or suspension of the blood, as if the heart has almost stopped beating or briefly stopped. The body laid asleep. This is like a shucking off of the body in a sense. It's a step short of that, that image that we have, or that concept that we have in Byron of the mind reft of its carnal life, which it hates. Okay, here it's the body laid asleep. The body is not disgustedly shed, right? It's just sort of put to sleep so it doesn't get in between you and what's outside of you, right? And that, it seems, again, much less radical than what we find in this moment in Byron. Moreover, seeing into the life of things, which is what you do when your body has been laid asleep, when you were laid asleep in body and become a living soul, seeing into the life of things, as Wordsworth imagines doing, okay, is outdone by the Byronic suspension of seeing things in favor of feeling them. Shall I not, once free of the body, feel all I now merely see, less dazzling but more warm? Now, when Wordsworth later in Tintern Abbey speaks of the sense sublime, you remember the sense sublime was something far more deeply interfused. He mentions a motion in a spirit that rolls through all things. And we may infer in that moment that this motion is something that he feels. But he feels it. It's not like Wordsworth doesn't feel. He feels it in the very blood, the very body, eschewed, rejected by the Byronic persona in this most radical naturalist moment in the poem, Childe Harold. Okay? So here's the larger generalization to take away from this. Byron, usually only tactically Wordsworthian, when Wordsworthian at all, nonetheless has moments of a more radical naturalism that we can find in the latter, Wordsworth.